War series of games have been around ever since the PlayStation 2, with the first game coming out in 2005. When it first came out, it was very notable for its gore, its violence, and its use of the Greek pantheon. All of the Greek gods, Zeus, Ares, Athena, were present in these games, but you played a Spartan by the name of Kratos, who is full of anger and fury against the gods who had robbed him of his family and his life. So you quest on these epic adventures in order to brutally murder as many gods as possible. And at the time, there was nothing like it. Nothing quite as satisfying as going up to Helios, the god of the sun, and just ripping his head off. Now, save for a few spin-off games, for a while there were 3 main games in the God of War series: God of War 1, 2, and 3. 3 being the most notable for its incredible boss fights, its conclusion to the story, and its over-the-top everything. But when God of War 3 ended, what happens is, Kratos, he takes the blade of Olympus and he runs it through his body, and he's bleeding out on the floor as hope leaves his corpse and goes all over humanity so that humanity can survive after, Kratos killed the god of the sun and the sea and the god of the underworld and the god of the sky, and everything was all messed up, and there was like tornadoes and volcanic eruptions and all the plants were dying, just so Kratos could get revenge on Zeus for all the bad stuff that happened to him. But see, the ending of God of War 3 was very ambiguous. We weren't really supposed to know if Kratos was alive or dead. The last thing that we see after Kratos stabs himself is like this big gigantic trail of blood that leaves into the sea, implying that Kratos has somehow survived and rolled off the ledge. And we were left to our imaginations to see what would happen with Kratos. Did he live? Did he die? We didn't know. Until a few weeks ago, when, lo and behold, the 4th main game in the God of War series came out, simply titled God of War. And this was a really big deal. It's been quite some time since we have a God of War game. The last one being God of War Ascension, which wasn't really part of the main series since it didn't really continue Kratos' story. It just kind of was like a little prequel before 1. It was okay. But God of War 4 had so much hype around it. I mean, everyone was freaking out saying, "Whoa, Kratos is back and it's a new game and he's got a beard and an axe and all this cool stuff, right?" And understandably so, with a franchise that is so well loved and etched into the minds of gamers that have played it over the years. Yeah, there was a lot to look forward to with the new God of War game. But how does it stand up? Was it worth all the hype? Well, I think so. The new God of War game, I'll just call it God of War rather than saying God of War 4 because it's not really called God of War 4, is a direct continuation of God of War 3. What happens is, after Kratos murders all of the Greek pantheon and the world turns to ruin and everyone's dying and crying and there's mess everywhere, he's like, well, might as well pack up and go somewhere else. So he does. He leaves the realm of Greek mythology to come to the realm of Norse mythology. And myself personally, I'm a huge fan of Norse mythology. I've read the entire book of every Norse mythology tale, and I'm just so enwrapped in it. I love everything about it. I love the characters, the events of Ragnarok, the serpent, the wolf, all these giants and elves and 9 realms and realms made of darkness and light and mist and fire. Needless to say, I was really excited to see how they did it. So Kratos goes to the realm of Norse mythology, finds a woman to settle down with, and raises a son named Atreus. And the opening of the game is the burial for the mother. And in typical Nordic style, they build this pyre, they set it on fire, and they let her body burn. And the quest of the story is not revenge against your father or trying to kill the god of war. No, no, no. It's pretty simple, really. You're going to go to the highest point, and you're going to scatter your dead wife's ashes with your son. And yes, it does get pretty complicated after that. The opening scene of God of War is so different than the other opening scenes of any of the other games in the series. Typically what happens is Kratos comes down, and there's a bunch of enemies, usually a cutscene of him yelling. Then what you gotta do, you get right into the action and start hacking away at people until everyone's dead. God of War opens up with this very somber, sad Kratos. You know, he's has his new weapon, his axe, and he's chopping at this tree and he's carrying it over. And there's something very different about this Kratos than from the Kratos that we grew up with and know. He's much more human, though he is still a god of war. And what I say by human is he's trying to move on from the events of his past. He's trying to move past all the horrible and terrible things that he did to innocent people, non-innocent people, heck, even his own father. And through that, he's trying to find redemption for his sins. I think it's nice to see a video game character mature over the series rather than stay the same, such as Duke Nukem, for example, who just stayed the same, and then that's why his franchise died. But seeing this new, sorrowful Kratos is very, very refreshing. So after the funeral, Kratos and his son set out and begin to explore the world of Norse mythology. Now what's cool is you actually get to explore some of the 9 realms. You get to explore the realm of mist, the realm of fire, the realm of the elves, and it's very true to Norse mythology to a certain extent. There are many liberties taken because this is a video game after all, and when you're dealing with topics like mythology, well, you kind of have free reign to do whatever you want. But it is done to the game's advantage. I like seeing this portrayal. Typically speaking, if you read anything about Norse mythology, the main characters are Odin, Thor, and Loki. There are other gods and other monsters and giants throughout the stories, but those are the 3 main characters that we see. A lot of other awesome gods from Norse mythology typically take a backseat. But not in this one. Odin, Thor, and Loki don't even show up. We hear stories about Odin and Thor, but Loki, we don't even hear anything about him till the very, very end of the game. And though the popular gods are not in the game, it's nice to see these smaller ones get some time. The big bad of the game, if you will, is Baldur. Now the story of Baldur goes as followed. In the legend for Ragnarok, it is supposed to be triggered by the death of Baldur. So what his mother Freya does is she goes to all the elements, all the creatures, everything throughout the world, and asks, please do not hurt my son. So anything physical, anything like iron, steel, ice, fire, nothing can hurt Baldur. Except one thing. One thing can hurt Baldur. Mistletoe. And the reason why mistletoe hurts Baldur from the story is that it was too young to understand the request of Freya, so she didn't even ask. And then, of course, in the story, Baldur gets killed by a dart thrown by his brother, made of mistletoe, and dies, and everyone cries, and then the Ragnarok is set to begin. But not in this one. It's a little bit different. And I like seeing this interpretation of Baldur. Rather than being the handsome, beautiful man that Baldur was supposed to be in the legend, he kind of looks like a drug addict. And he's like broken and tired of immortality. Now see, the way that he's portrayed in this game is that he's tired of not being able to feel anything. He can't feel intoxicated. He can't feel the embrace of a woman. He can't feel pain. Nothing. And that makes him like angry and crazy and very hateful against his mother. But it's characters like that that really do shine in God of War, and of course Kratos and his son Atreus. Now I will say that the story is the biggest selling point of this game. Of course the game is very graphically appealing, but the story of Kratos redeeming himself and teaching Atreus how to hunt and to fight and to protect himself is somewhat touch-warming. It does kind of remind you of The Last of Us a little bit, but with a lot less zombies and a lot of more like axe throwing. But it's still very, very good, especially for a God of War game. And the biggest driving point of the game is to keep playing, to see what happens next in the story. Who will we encounter next? What creature will we encounter next? It's all very, very well done. Now I will say this. I was a little uncertain about the combat within God of War when I first played it and heard of it. And the combat isn't necessarily anything great. See, every other God of War game had this combat that was like really fast and really like edgy and heavy, where you'd be whipping around chains and throwing dudes and picking them up and all this cool stuff. And you can do similar stuff in this new God of War, but it's not the same. It's not quite as fast, and combat is a little more difficult than in previous games. While not necessarily a bad thing, I feel like the combat is not the strongest point of the game. Don't get me wrong, visually it's very impressive, and it feels awesome if you bring down your axe and you smash it on a guy, you rip him open, and there's like magma and blood and ice coming everywhere. Visually it's awesome. But from a gameplay mechanic, it can get kind of repetitive, which can be attributed to the other games in the God of War series. I don't want to talk too much about the story, only because it really is better if you experience it for yourself. But I will say that God of War leaves you wanting more for the story. And while the game is good, it can take some time to complete. I feel like the main quest can be completed fairly quickly. All I hope is that they don't release DLC and make you pay like another $60 to do more. That's just stupid. But the way the game ended, it does look like there's gonna be another one. We just have to wait and see how that goes. Now, one thing that did disappoint me just a little bit was the lack of bosses. Now, there are a very few bosses within the game that are really bosses. I'm talking like Baldur, this like big-ass electric dragon, and then Thor's two sons. They make for some excellent boss fights. However, they're so few and far between the course of the campaign that it really gets frustrating that when you walk into a room, there's the same guys you've seen before, and before, and before. Now, I do understand that this is not God of War 3, whereas it was like boss fight, boss fight, boss fight, boss fight, boss fight. It just would have been nice to see some more characters than the ones that were given, and see some more boss fights, because the ones that are in the game are incredible. I just kind of wish there was more of them to break up the monotony of the combat. The last thing that I will say about the game is that it's not entirely necessary to play the other games in the series. It helps if you know who Kratos is and where he comes from, but the game does a very good job of introducing the story of Kratos to new fans through the gameplay and the cutscenes, etc. So if you're new to the series, God of War is not a bad place to start. I would recommend personally that you play some of the other games, or maybe even just God of War 3, to get the gist of what Kratos is like and why he is the way that he is in this new game. But there is a lot of fun and a lot of enjoyment to be had for the old fans and the new fans too. Ultimately, I would highly recommend God of War. It is by no means 100% a perfect game, but for what the game goes to do, it does incredibly well. And the story is so awesome that it really ties the whole game together quite beautifully. It's a beautiful game visually and story-wise, and this definitely belongs in any PlayStation 4 owner's library. Well, thank you guys so much for watching my first episode of God of War. I am working on a little side project where I'll be talking about the original, but I don't want to give too many secrets about that. You know, I gotta save the surprise for later. But thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Kirk Talk, and I will see you guys in the next one.